Hi, welcome back to Learn Buffalo in Go. This video is about integrating with third-party services, something like a database or an email service. Today we're going to do that using a mongoDB instance, Sendgrid for email delivery, and a Slack webhook. Where can we add this integration into our current app? Let's pick up where we left off in part 7, where we had user registration and user authentication. Right now we allow any user with a proper username and password to create an account. Imagine we had a list of users that we did not want to allow access to the site. And that list is going to be stored in a database somewhere. In this case we'll use mongoDB to hold that list of blocked users. So before creating that new user, we'll check Mongo if the user is blocked and simply return the user to the new user registration form. What if that new user is not listed as a blocked user? Then we can create the new account and send out notifications. It's common to send an email notification with the new user's email. We can use Sendgrid to do that. And we can also use the Slack webhook URL to send a notification to maybe the site administrators. To process the last two notifications, we're going to use the Buffalo events package. The Buffalo docs have a nice page on events. If you haven't used events before, there are two critical parts. One is the event that gets fired. Typically it has some data, maybe a message or a payload. And then there's an event listener, something that responds to events and then fires off its own logic. This pattern of using events and event listeners is fairly common, and it helps connect to the different packages in an application without having to manually wire up all those connections. So how do we connect to third-party services? We're going to need credentials to use those services. In this example, we're using Slack, mongoDB, and Sendgrid. Slack allows administrators to create a webhook URL where you can post messages to. That looks something like this here. MongoDB is going to have a full set of configuration similar to any database, user, password, host, the name of the database, and the name of the collection or the table in Mongo. Sendgrid is a service that allows us to send emails via an API, and to do that we need to have an API key. We also want to set an admin email, which will be the from email address when we send emails. Sendgrid will check that and make sure that it's registered on the account. So I'm going to fill in my data here. If you want to use those services, you can create your own accounts and get some credentials and set them in your .env file. The last piece we need for this example is an instance of MongoDB. You can create one in the cloud, or you can host one locally using Docker. I'm going to do that. The official Mongo Docker release as an example using Docker Compose. That's going to include the MongoDB as well as Mongo Express, which is a nice UI to view the records in your databases. So if I copy that official documentation into my own Docker Compose file, one addition I made here is to add a volume, and that allows us to persist the data between starting and stopping our Docker. And here's Mongo Express. We have a Learn Buffalo database with a banned users collection, and we can see we have one entry here in that database, and that's what we'll use to test our application now. So our first step is going to be checking Mongo to see if the user email in a new user request is blocked. If we look at our code from part 7 where we added user registration and authentication, we're performing that logic here in the users.go file in the actions package, users create. So right here is where we try to create the user, and right here is where we're going to want to add that check. Since Buffalo has no default way to manage a Mongo database connection, one easy way to do that is just to create a new package within our application. We'll call this new package Mongo Connector, and I have a config file and a Mongo Connector file. The config file helps us get all those credentials from the environment, and this Mongo Connector file is where we're going to make connections to the MongoDB instance. To make things easier, we will use the official library from Mongo for Go. Install that with this command. And now if we come back, we don't have any errors with library dependencies. One pattern you see here is the init function for this package. When we look at models, this is one of the default packages from Buffalo. We see the same thing here. The Buffalo models package has this init function to get the credentials and make a connection to the database for the application to use. So when does that init function fire? If we go back to our app.go file in the actions package, we can see the Buffalo Pop middleware is setting up that connection right here as it starts the application. We can do something similar with our Mongo package. So here we have a ping function that I've created just to test that the connection to Mongo is good. So the new pieces are here, trying to connect to mongoDB banned users collection, and that's what we would expect to see. Depending on what kind of third-party services you're using, you may decide whether that connection is critical or not to the application. If it's critical and that health check fails, you may want to panic and stop the application from launching. So now we return to users.go and we add the last piece, which is to check if the user email in the request is banned. So you see, if that check fails, then we just redirect the user without creating a new account. And here we see how that message is shown. No user is created. So our Mongo connector package is working. We'll take a quick look to see what else might be needed here. One thing you'll notice is we have a user struct in this Mongo connector package. We do that to sort of shadow the user model we have in our models package, and that's because Mongo manages IDs differently than our other database, which is using MariaDB or MySQL. So that's the first step of our process down. The next step is to use events to send messages to Sendgrid and to Slack. If events are new to you, be sure to check out the page on the Buffalo docs about events. There are two parts to an event. One is to create the event and add the necessary information. The second part is to add an event listener to respond to the specific event you've created. In our application, we're still looking at this users create method, and now we want to respond to when a successful user has been created. And this is where we'll want to add the logic to fire that event. This example shows how we create an event, and we can define the kind, message, and payload data. The kind of the event is a string, but it does have three parts here. The recommendation is that the first part is maybe the application name, the second part might be the name of a package, and the third part might be an action or some sort of task to take within that. Buffalo does have some default events that fire when actions happen, and you can see how those work in the official docs. So once we've created an event, we need to emit it, and this is an example of how we can do that. Here on line 57 is another example of how to emit an event. So this is step one. We create an event and we emit it, but nothing's going to happen unless something listens for that event and responds to it. In order to create a new event listener, we want to do that when the application is starting up. So here in our app.go file, we test the connection to the database. We've added a test to our Mongo connection, and we can also set up event listeners here. If we look at the Buffalo docs, they recommend creating an init function, so let's do that. So this code should add a listener for our new event. One thing to realize is every event in Buffalo will pass through this function. So we need to filter the events for the type that we're looking for. There are different ways to do that. You can use a switch statement, if-else check, but it's most common to check the kind of event. In our case, we only want to respond to the Learn Buffalo user register kind event. The other important thing to notice here is how we get the payload out of the event. So event has a payload property, and we can use the pluck method to retrieve the data that we sent when we emitted the event in the start. The rest of this code here is just sending an HTTP request to Slack, so let's see if this works. In the background, I have my Buffalo dev server working. Looks like we have some errors. And we'll use go mod tidy to clean up those package imports. So let's test this out. If we try to create a new user that isn't in the banned list, then we should expect to send a notification to Slack. So we get the welcome to Buffalo message, which is what we would expect. I have another machine here running Slack, and I can see that that message was sent successfully. So the last piece here is to send a notification via Sendgrid to the new user's email. To show you how events can connect different packages in our application, we're going to create a new package for Sendgrid to hold this new functionality. Just to make it easier to make API requests to Sendgrid, we'll use the Sendgrid official Go library. And our new package is called Sendgrid_mailer, just to make sure that we don't have any confusion. So in our new Sendgrid mailer package, we have a real basic test. This is just to verify that the credentials are set up. And the other file has a couple of pieces. We also have an init function here, just like the other packages. And this is going to register that new event listener. And here we fetch that username from the event and use this send function just to send the new email using that Sendgrid API. The other piece is this register function, which is similar to what we did with Mongo, just to ping the database to make sure that we have an actual connection. This is important because we're creating a new package. Buffalo doesn't know about it unless we tell it that it exists. And the best way to do that is in our app.go file when the app is starting up. So the last piece to add is after we ping our Mongo connection, we're going to call that register function in the Sendgrid mailer package. This is important because we have an event listener. If we don't do this, Buffalo doesn't know that that event listener exists. So now that we have all these pieces together, let's see how it works. So we got the welcome message, which indicates that the new user was created in Buffalo. If we look at our logs, we see that our Sendgrid package shows mail was delivered. And if you were listening, you may have heard the Slack notification on my other computer here. So all the pieces are working. So that's a quick demonstration of using events. Remember, we had one event that fired once, but we had multiple listeners in different packages that were able to respond to that event and do their work. That's it for now. If you want to see the details of the code, it's on GitHub, and thanks for watching.